Señoras y señores, bienvenidos al Teatro de la Universidad de Puerto Rico. La presentación va a comenzar. Por favor, vayan ocupando sus asientos. Les recordamos que tomar fotos y el uso de todo equipo de grabación está prohibido en la sala. Les solicitamos además que apaguen sus teléfonos móviles y otros equipos electrónicos. Esta es su tercera y última llamada. Disfruten la presentación.
Buenos días y bienvenidos al Teatro de la Universidad de Puerto Rico. Soy Luis Aníbal Avilés, decano asociado de la Escuela de Derecho, y en representación de la decana Vivian Neptune Rivera, quien se encuentra en viaje oficial fuera de Puerto Rico, les doy la más cordial bienvenida a la conferencia magistral del profesor Joseph Stiglitz, laureado profesor de Economía de la Universidad de Columbia en Nueva York. Deseamos reconocer en este evento la presencia de los dignatarios y miembros del Gobierno de Puerto Rico, comenzando por el honorable Charlie Hernández, representante de la Cámara de Representantes, la señora jueza asociada del Tribunal Supremo, honorable Eliana Fiolmata, señor juez asociado del Tribunal Supremo, honorable Eric Kolthoff Caraballo, la señora secretaria de la Gobernación, la ingeniera Ingrid Vilá Biaggi, miembros de la rama judicial y de la rama ejecutiva del Estado Libre Asociado, presidente de la Junta de Gobierno de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, doctor Jorge Sánchez, presidente de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, doctor Uroyoan Walker Ramos, rectora interina del recinto de Río Piedras, doctora Ethel Ríos Orlandi, miembros de la Junta de Gobierno de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, pasado presidente de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, licenciado Antonio García Padilla, pasado presidente interina de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, la doctora Celeste Freites, pasado rector del recinto de Río Piedras, el doctor Juan Fernández, presidenta del Colegio de Abogados de Puerto Rico, la licenciada Ana Irma Rivera Lacén, presidente del Centro para la Nueva Economía, el señor Miguel Soto Clas, presidenta de la Asociación de Economistas de Puerto Rico, la doctora Mónica González Bonín, decanos y decanas, senadores y senadoras académicos, miembros del claustro de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, estudiantes, miembros de la prensa, invitados e invitadas todos. Nos llena de mucha satisfacción que el Centro para la Nueva Economía, el Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, la American Civil Liberties Union, hayan hecho posible la visita del profesor Joseph Stiglitz y que nuestra Escuela de Derecho, su Clínica de Asistencia Legal y la Revista Jurídica de la Universidad de Puerto Rico sean parte de esta iniciativa de brindar un espacio para la reflexión y el compartir de ideas en el momento histórico en que nos encontramos. Nos honra sobremanera la presencia entre nosotros del profesor Stiglitz, Premio Nobel en Ciencias Económicas del año 2001. El profesor Stiglitz se une a la larga tradición de economistas de la Universidad de Colombia que, como el pasado rector de esta universidad, Rexford Tocqueville, retaron la ortodoxia de la economía clásica y sembraron en Puerto Rico sus idearios, que bien nos ha servido durante los pasados 70 años. Que para bien sea su presencia entre nosotros este día. Sin más, para hablarles sobre esta novel colaboración entre la Clínica de Asistencia Legal de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, el Centro para la Nueva Economía, el Centro de Periodismo Investigativo y la American Civil Liberties Union, les presento a la directora de la Clínica de Asistencia Legal, la profesora María L. Jiménez. Buen día.
Buenos días a todos y todas. Con la visita del doctor Joseph Stiglitz a la Universidad de Puerto Rico, la Clínica de Asistencia Legal de la Escuela de Derecho celebra el comienzo de un proyecto de investigación y servicio para promover el cambio social. Bajo el liderato del Centro para una Nueva Economía y con la participación del capítulo de Puerto Rico de la American Civil Liberties Union y el Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, emprenderemos múltiples iniciativas dirigidas a fortalecer la capacidad cívica, promover la transparencia en la gestión gubernamental, procurar la equidad socioeconómica y facilitar el acceso a la justicia. Bajo la dirección del profesor Efrén Rivera Ramos, el proyecto cuenta con una importante aportación de Open Society Foundations que nos permitirá elaborar un plan de acción dirigido a lograr cambios sistémicos en la sociedad. Esta aportación requiere de la integración y contribución de otros aliados del sector no gubernamental, así como la colaboración de las 3 ramas de gobierno del país. La Clínica de Asistencia Legal asume esta responsabilidad con el compromiso que ha caracterizado una tradición de 62 años, ofreciendo orientación y representación legal a personas, grupos y comunidades que padecen las consecuencias de la desigualdad. Una desigualdad que muchas veces resulta del desbalance económico, pero también la desigualdad que padecen los que no carecen de recursos pero son invisibilizados por políticas discriminatorias que les niegan el disfrute de su humanidad. La clínica estará a cargo de formular y ejecutar iniciativas cónsonas con el acceso a la justicia. A la vez, estará trabajando conjuntamente con las demás organizaciones en la consecución de los objetivos comunes que nos reúnen. Desde la Clínica de Asistencia Legal lo haremos como parte de una universidad que está y tiene que continuar estando al servicio del país. En consideración de todo lo anterior, la conferencia magistral que hoy presentamos, gracias al auspicio del Centro para una Nueva Economía, es un comienzo oportuno. Así, los invitamos a todos y todas a unirse a este gran esfuerzo con tal de propiciar el diálogo y articular nuevos espacios para atender las necesidades del país. Por último, debo señalarles que los ujieres han distribuido tarjetas que posteriormente serán recogidas según ustedes lo indiquen para aquellos que tengan a bien hacer preguntas a nuestro invitado, sujeto a las limitaciones de tiempo que impone la agenda del Dr. Stiglitz. Ahora, el profesor Efrén Rivera Ramos presentará a nuestro invitado. Muchas gracias.
Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Me uno al saludo protocolar, pero quisiera decirles que el señor presidente de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, el doctor Urayoan Walker, y la señora rectora del recinto, la doctora Ethel Ríos, me han solicitado que les dé un saludo muy especial de su parte. Ellos han apoyado esta actividad desde el principio. Además, me han dicho lo siguiente, que ellos, digo yo ahora, muy generosamente y con un gran espíritu universitario, han decidido prescindir ellos del saludo protocolar, por lo que me han dicho, para que el doctor Stiglitz tenga más tiempo para hablar y para que ustedes tengan tiempo de hacer preguntas. Paso ahora a la presentación. El doctor Joseph Stiglitz es una figura de alcance internacional con una larga trayectoria de trabajo intelectual dedicado al análisis de los más acuciantes problemas económicos y sociales de nuestro tiempo. Obtuvo su doctorado en MIT en el 1967 y en 1970 ya era catedrático de la Universidad de Yale. En el año 1979 obtuvo el premio John Bates Clark, concedido cada 2 años por la Asociación Americana de Economía al economista joven que hubiera realizado la contribución más importante en su disciplina. Ha sido profesor en las más prestigiosas universidades. Ha recibido más de 40 doctorados honoris causa. Actualmente es profesor en la Universidad de Columbia en Nueva York. Allí fundó y copreside la Iniciativa para el Diálogo sobre Política Pública. Esta entidad reúne a prominentes economistas, científicos sociales y centros académicos y de política pública para analizar desde una perspectiva comprensiva los problemas que enfrentan los países en desarrollo. Según la información provista por la iniciativa, esta se dedica a promover, y cito, un discurso más inclusivo y pluralista sobre los principales debates globales en torno al desarrollo económico y político, en los cuales los países se encuentran con frecuencia con un conjunto reducido de prescripciones de política pública que pueden no ajustarse completamente a sus preferencias y capacidades domésticas. Cierra la cita. La iniciativa, además, y vuelvo a citar, ayuda a los países a analizar los complejos dilemas de política pública que enfrentan y les provee acceso a una gama más amplia de soluciones económicas que propicien el desarrollo democrático, equitativo y sostenible. Cierra la cita. En el 2001, el doctor Stiglitz recibió por todo su trabajo el Premio Nobel de Economía, pero especialmente por sus análisis de mercados con información asimétrica. Fue también uno de los autores principales del informe de 1995 del Panel Intergubernamental sobre Cambio Climático, organismo creado por la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas, que en el 2007 compartió el Premio Nobel de la Paz con el exvicepresidente de los Estados Unidos, Al Gore. En 2011, la prensa mundial difundió la presencia y participación de Stiglitz en el primer Foro Social 15M, celebrado en Madrid en apoyo a las protestas de los indignados. Ese mismo año, la revista Time le incluyó entre las 100 personas más influyentes del mundo. En la actualidad preside la Asociación Internacional de Economía. Nuestro conferenciante invitado ha publicado un sinnúmero de libros de gran difusión internacional. Su libro Globalization and its Discontents, del año 2002, ha sido traducido a 35 idiomas y ha vendido más de 1 millón de copias mundialmente. En el 2010 publicó el libro Free Fall, America, Free Markets and the Sinking of the World Economy, en el que analizó los orígenes de la Gran Recesión y predijo muchos de los sucesos de la crisis financiera y el colapso económico que hemos presenciado en años recientes. Su libro más reciente, The Price of Inequality, How Today's Divided Society Endangers Our Future, publicado en el 2012, va por su segunda edición y es el que le sirve de título a esta conferencia, El costo de la desigualdad. Se trata de una obra enjundiosa que analiza los efectos perturbadores de la desigualdad en el desarrollo, la democracia y el Estado de Derecho, entre otros aspectos de la economía y la política en la sociedad estadounidense. El mensaje, tanto como las credenciales excepcionales del mensajero, explican por qué la Clínica de Asistencia Legal de la Escuela de Derecho y la revista jurídica de la UPR aceptaron sin reparos la generosa oferta del Centro para una Nueva Economía de poner a nuestra disposición al doctor Stiglitz para que se dirigiera hoy a nosotros, los universitarios, sobre un tema de extrema pertinencia para nuestro país. Y sin más, aunque podría decir muchísimo más, dejo con ustedes al Premio Nobel de Economía, el doctor Joseph E. Stiglitz.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I wish I could have understood it. It's a real pleasure to be back here at the university. I don't know if he mentioned that I was here some 41 years ago giving a lecture, probably before most of you were born. It took me a little while to get back, but I finally made it. I'm going to be talking about the price of inequality and some of the implications for Puerto Rico. But before I get into I want to describe more broadly what might be described as the malaise in which the United States and more broadly the North Atlantic has been mired in. for the last more than half a decade, because it has a lot to do with the inequality that we are now experiencing. The United States has been experiencing very slow growth. Our economy now is about 15% below our potential, below where we would have been had we not had the crisis in 2008. Our growth is so slow that we are barely able to create enough jobs for the new entrants into the labor force, an issue which you can be familiar with and has obviously very serious consequences for young graduates. In most countries in Europe, the GDP per capita adjusted for inflation is lower than it was 5 years ago. We were told that it was a financial crisis. We were told that because it was a financial crisis, basically we ought to focus our attention on fixing the banks. And that was why we gave so much money to the banks. Well, we have largely fixed the financial sector. I don't think we fully fixed it, and I'll have a few words to say about that later. But it's very clear that having fixed the banks and given them hundreds of billions of dollars, that our problems have not been solved. And that suggests that there were deeper problems even before the crisis. And I believe that to be the case. The country was, in many senses, from an economic perspective, sick before the crisis. And the crisis and the problems of the economy were masked over by the bubble. What the bubble enabled the United States to do was to continue to grow, even though there were some fundamental weaknesses. As a result of the bubble, the bottom 80% of Americans were consuming 110% of their income. And you don't have to have a PhD to figure out that that's not sustainable. And as one of my predecessors as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors once said, that which is not sustainable won't be sustained. And this was not sustained. The breaking of the bubble itself left in its wake even deeper problems: a legacy of debt, an overhang of real estate. Today, both of these are being worked out. Some of the debt has been repaid. We've had underinvestment in real estate for 5 years, and the overhang has largely, but not entirely, been corrected. But that means, having dealt with these two issues, we are left back with our original problem. And so I want to describe very briefly what I see those original problems. What were the problems that we had in 2007, 8, and the years before the crisis that was masked over by the bubble that the Fed helped create? Well, I would describe it as fivefold. The first is growing inequality, which is the subject of my talk, and I'll come back to that. But before I begin to focus on that, I want to put it into a broader context. The second is there was a need for structural reform. All countries are almost constantly in need of structural reform, but we were facing a particularly acute problem, and we weren't dealing with it. The need for structural reform has to do with the decline in manufacturing. You might say the successes we were having in manufacturing. When I say successes, what was happening was that we were having enormous increases in productivity in manufacturing, increases in productivity that outpaced the growth in demand in manufacturing. And when productivity increases outpace demand, employment goes down. And when employment goes down, the workers have to get jobs somewhere else. We had to restructure our economy. In a way, this issue was analogous to that which the country faced 80, 100 years ago, when we moved from agriculture to manufacturing. Then again, we were the victim of our own success, beginning with government actions in the Morrill Act in 1863. Investments in research and extension services paid off. In the 19th century, about 70% of all workers worked in agriculture. But because of the investments in research, productivity was increasing, again, enormously, and fewer workers were needed to produce the food that we needed. So today, for instance, only 2 to 3% of our workforce is engaged in agriculture, and it produces more food than even an obese society can consume. So that's a success, but it's also a problem because all those workers, the 70% of the labor force, had to go from agriculture into something else. And that something else in that time was manufacturing. Today we face a double problem. We have to move globally. Productivity in manufacturing has exceeded increases in demand, and that means globally manufacturing employment is going down. And that means globally there has to be restructuring. But in the United States and the other advanced countries, there's a change in what might be called global comparative advantage. The growth of China, India, other countries has meant that a larger fraction of that global employment will occur outside of the United States. And so we have to restructure our economy, move out of manufacturing into other sectors. Markets on their own don't do this kind of restructuring well. It's always needed government. But just at the time that we need more government to help us restructure, government is pulling back. And so that's the second problem. The third is that we've underinvested in the public sector. We've underinvested in infrastructure, technology, and education, a whole host of things where public investment is absolutely essential. Any of you that visit New York City will understand what I mean when I say underinvestment in infrastructure. Coming down here, I had to go to the airport, and it's worse than the roads are worse than in the developing country. And you have to be very healthy to withstand the shock that you get as you go along the road. There's obviously no reason why the United States should have poor roads, poor airports, a worse education system than many countries in Asia. It is a decision that we've made, and I think it's the wrong decision. Fourthly, we have a dysfunctional financial system. There are many symptoms of this dysfunctional financial system and many consequences. For instance, before the crisis, the financial system was taking up 8% of GDP, 40% of all corporate profits. The financial sector is supposed to serve the rest of the economy, but in fact, it was not. It was not lending, especially to small and medium-sized enterprises. It was not serving the basic societal functions of allocating capital well, managing risk, running an efficient payment system. Of course, there were parts of the financial system, like Silicon Valley, that were providing finance to new enterprises, but that was a minuscule fraction of the financial sector. What it was particularly good at doing were things like predatory and discriminatory lending, abusive credit card practices, market manipulation, anti-competitive practices, a whole list of things that they were very innovative at. But as a consequence of that kind of innovation, it did not lead to investments in the private sector that would have sustained our economy. This is not just my view of the kind of innovation that the financial sector. Paul Volcker, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve, once said that he couldn't identify a single innovation of the financial sector that had led to higher economic growth except the ATM machine. And he was wrong, because the ATM machine was a British innovation. The fifth problem that we faced was a global economic system that was also dysfunctional, with large global imbalances. There was a great deal of worry before the crisis that a disorderly unwinding of these global imbalances would lead to financial instability. And now we are aware of another consequence of these global imbalances, a deficiency of global aggregate demand. Ben Bernanke, the previous chairman of our Federal Reserve, talked about a savings glut. But that was a particularly American perspective and an attempt to shift blame for the global crisis to China. From a global perspective, it was actually shocking that he would say a thing like that. There's not an excess of savings in the world. If you look around the world, there are huge investment needs. In developing countries, there's needs for infrastructure. Globally, we need to invest to retrofit the global economy to address the problems of global warming. So no one could say that we have a dearth of investment needs. The problem was there was a failure of our global financial system, our global economic system, to redeploy the savings to areas where there were high social returns. The consequences of that in the United States were clear. You had this flow of money not going into new enterprises, going in to create new jobs, but to create shoddy homes in the middle of the Nevada desert. Now, the good thing, I mentioned before, that we are largely dealing with our excessive construction of homes. One of the advantages that we had is that we made those homes very shoddy, so they're not lasting very long, so that the imbalance between supply and demand is being corrected more rapidly than would normally be the case. But here, this morning, I wanted to talk about the first of these causes of our current malaise, and that is inequality. And I want to talk about it from a very broad perspective, and then I'll talk about some of the things that might be done about it. The first thing I want to observe is that inequality has been growing in most countries around the world, but not all countries. Several of the Latin American countries, admittedly marked by high levels of inequality, have actually had a reduction in the degree of inequality. Brazil is an example. And Brazil highlights the fact that government policies can make a difference. In Brazil, a series of governments, beginning with Cardoso and continuing with Lula, decided first to invest in education and then to invest in making sure that all children got access to medicine, got access to food. And what's so remarkable is that in a relatively short period of time, the benefits of these public investments began to show up in the statistics. And that's quite remarkable. Let me just say, quite often you undertake a program, and it takes a very long time for the benefits to show up in the aggregate statistics, the macroeconomic statistics that we look at. But in the case of Brazil, it has already shown up. Now, I said that inequality is growing in most countries around the world, but America always does things a little bit better. And America has achieved the distinction of having the most inequality of any of the advanced industrial countries. And it actually does that by quite a margin. A few countries are emulating the United States, are trying to keep up with the United States. UK is an example. Not doing too bad, but still we are winning the race. The Inequality in the United States takes many, many dimensions. There is inequality at the top. The top 1% in the United States gets somewhere between 20 and 25% of all the income. There's inequality in wealth, which has been described in a variety of ways, much greater than inequality of income. The top 1% has somewhere between a third and 40% of all the wealth. The Walton family, originally owners of Walmart, that firm that is well known for its good labor relations, the way it's excelled in corruption in Mexico and its discriminatory practices, all these have resulted in that one family having as much wealth as the bottom 30% of America, which is testimony both to how much wealth there is at the top and how little wealth there is at the bottom. There are inequalities in health that are resulting in actually, in some metrics, a decline in life expectancy at the bottom, certainly among those who are just who have not managed to graduate from high school. Probably the worst dimension of inequality, though, is inequality of opportunity. America has always defined itself and have been defined by others as a land of opportunity, the American dream. But we now know that that is a myth. And actually, it's been a myth for some time. America has less equality of opportunity than almost any of the other advanced countries, including old Europe, that we used to castigate as being ossified. But they were worried about their lack of opportunity in the aftermath of World War II, and so they did something about it. And so in virtually all of those countries, there is more opportunity than there is in the United States. And what do I mean by that? Well, of course, we all know stories of people who make it from the bottom to the top, and many of us know people who've made that transition. Newspapers write about these kinds of success stories all the time. But that's exactly the point. Newspapers don't write about dogs that bite people, they write about people that bite dogs. And the reason that newspapers write about the stories of people that make it from the bottom to the top is that it's so unusual. And so when economists or social scientists talk about equality of opportunity, they don't mean stories, they don't mean anecdotes, they mean statistics. What is the likelihood of moving from the bottom to the middle or the bottom to the top? What are the prospects of the typical young person? And in terms of those statistics, the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in any of the other advanced industrial countries. And that should be very troubling to us. The lack of opportunity and the high level of inequality are in fact linked. Alan Kruger, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, earlier in the Obama administration, called this linkage the Great Gatsby. There's a clear linkage, not only when we look across countries, but even when we look across states in the United States. Those states, like those in the South, with the highest degree of inequality, are also the states with the least equality, with the greatest equality of outcomes. The two are linked, and there are a whole variety of hypotheses about why that is the case. Now, I mentioned before that inequality is growing in most countries, but not all. And that fact in itself is both, tells an important story and should be a source of hope. It means that it's not just economics that's driving the growth of inequality. The laws of economics apply on both sides of the Atlantic. They're not a special set of laws that apply in the United States that don't apply in the European countries and Scandinavia. The reason that the United States has more inequality and less equality of opportunity is a result of policies and politics. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit later about what some of those specific policies and politics are. There's some other observations that when we look at the data concerning inequality that tells us some important lessons. The fact that I mentioned there are many dimensions to inequality. One of them is the growth of inequality at the top, the larger share that people that the people at the top get. Another one is the growth of poverty at the bottom. More people are in poverty. And there's been a hollowing out in the middle. The incomes in the middle of the people in the middle have not been doing very well. President Obama has talked about it in terms of the squeezed middle class. It's also the case that the fraction of the population that lies within a band of the middle is getting smaller, and more of the population lie in the tail. But the fact that the top has grown, the middle suffered, shows that trickle-down economics doesn't work. The idea of trickle-down economics was that if you threw enough money at the top, everybody would benefit. It would trickle down to everybody. I wish it were true, because if it were true, we would all be doing very well. We've thrown a lot of money at the top. They are doing very, very well. But those in the middle are not. Just to give you a feeling for how bad things are, median income, median is half above, half below. Median family income in the United States today is lower than it was more than 2 decades ago. It's basically at the level that it was a quarter century ago. We've had stagnation for a quarter of century. But if we look at particular demographic groups in the United States, things are even worse. One demographic group that I have a lot of sympathy for are men. And in those terms, median income of a full-time male worker in the United States is lower than it was 40 years ago. And if you talk about the median income of a full-time male worker who does not have a college education, who's just graduated from high school, it's down about 20% adjusted for inflation. So their incomes have actually been declining. So what is very clear is that trickle-down economics has not been working. It never worked anywhere, but it's particularly not been working in the United States. Well, the next natural question is, why is there so much inequality in the United States? How can we explain it? And that is obviously a complicated question. I can only touch on some aspects. The aspect I want to emphasize right now is that inequality in large measure is associated with what economists call rank seeking. There are 2 ways of getting wealthy, for those of you who aspire to that. One way is to produce something valuable, to think of a new idea and to commercialize it. The other one is to get a larger share of the national income. We call it wealth appropriation. One is wealth creation, the one is wealth appropriation. We think of the oil-rich countries in the Middle East, for instance, as rent-seeking economies. They have a certain amount of oil, that's the source of their wealth. They don't produce anything, they just basically take that oil. The question is, who gets the value of the oil? And what happens is in these countries, typically weak, not democratic, is that there's a fighting over who gets the ranks. And in the process of fighting over the ranks get destroyed. There's no wealth creation. It is basically rank seeking. Well, unthinkingly, to a large extent, the United States has become a country of rank seekers. There are a whole variety of examples of this rank seeking. Monopolies are an example where the way a monopolist gets a high income is to restrict production rather than to expand production. If you look at the list of Forbes 100, several of the people at the very top have gotten their money largely, not entirely, but largely through the exercise of monopoly power. It's not that they didn't do some innovation, but in a competitive economy, even if you're innovative, there are other innovative people, and the amount of money that you can get out of innovation is limited by competition. But these monopolists have been very innovative in figuring out how to exercise monopoly power. It's an understandable exercise of creativity, but not one which benefits the rest of society. You can see it in telecom, where telephone rates in the United States are something like 10 times the level that they are in more competitive economies like India. And you can see it even worse in countries like Mexico, where telephone rates are about 10 times that in the United States. Not a surprise that the owner of the telecom industry in Mexico is very, very wealthy. There are other examples of rank seeking. The CEOs in the United States, the average CEO today has a pay something like 250 times that of the average worker. He may be productive, but is he that productive? In particular, there are other dynamic economies, India, China, Japan, Europe, where CEOs get more pay than the average worker, but the ratio is 10, 30, but nowhere near 250 to 300 times. There is no way you can justify the degree of inequality in the United States by differentials in productivity. It's simply that there are deficiencies in our corporate governance laws that give them the scope to take a larger share of the corporate income and divert it to their own interest, saying that as a consequence, they don't have money to invest in the company. I can understand the pain they feel as they have to fire workers, and firing workers is unpleasant, but if they didn't pay themselves so much wages, they wouldn't have to fire so many workers. The more important point I want to emphasize is that for 200 years, and some of you in your courses have learned, economics courses, have learned that economists have tried to justify the degree of inequality that we have in terms of a theory called the marginal productivity theory. People at the top get higher pay because of the higher contribution to our society. That's nonsense. There are some people, let me make it clear, there are some people for which that's true, but we're talking about by and large. That point was never clearer than in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. I don't remember if you remember the huge controversy we had at that time about the bonuses. Remember, the CEOs of the banks had led the world to the brink of ruin. They had led their companies to the brink of ruin. And yet, in 2008 and 2009, the banks paid out millions and millions and millions of taxpayer dollars as bonuses to the CEOs. And was it for outstanding performance? Some of them were so embarrassed by this that they said, we'll have to change the name. We'll call it retention bonus rather than performance bonus. But then you had to ask the question, why would you want to retain somebody who had brought the company to the brink of ruin? Well, it was clear that the underlying problem was one of deficiencies in corporate governance. If we ask, what about those who really made a big contribution to our society? People who had invented the transistor, the laser, the basic mathematics underlying the computer, the discoverer of DNA. None of these people are in the Forbes 100. None of these are among the wealthiest in our society. I want to come now to what I view as the most important part of inequality in the United States, and that really is the title of my book, The Price of Inequality. I believe that we are paying a very large price, a very large economic price, for the high level of inequality that we have. I think there's a strong moral issue about inequality. I think inequality has severe political and social consequences that I'll talk about in a minute. But I actually think that there's also a large economic price. It used to be said that by some people on the right, yes, we understand inequality is not such a good thing, but if we do anything about it, we'll kill the goose that lays the golden egg. We'll have to give up growth. We'll give up efficiency. We'll pay a high price to get rid of inequality. In other words, they talk about there being a trade-off between growth and equality. And we now know that that's wrong. We can actually have a stronger economy and a more equal society. Even traditionally conservative institutions like the IMF have today recognized that the extent to which inequality has increased in the United States and the form of inequality has been associated with, led to instability and lower economic growth. Let me just mention some of the causal mechanisms, some of the mechanisms through which this occurs. The first I've already talked about, which is we have a distorted economy. I talked about how rent-seeking is a major source of inequality, and rent-seeking weakens the economy. So that's one example. At the bottom, some of the inequality is a result of discrimination, and that too weakens our economy. A second aspect of why inequality weakens our economy is related to what I talked about again earlier, inequality of opportunity. Inequality of opportunity, particularly that related to equality of opportunity of education, means that those who made the mistake of choosing the wrong parents are not going to live up to their potential. That we are wasting our most valuable resource, our human resources. The third reason that we are paying a large economic price is that societies in which there are large divides typically are reluctant to make the necessary investments in the public sector. I talked before about one of the key problems facing the United States is that we've underinvested in infrastructure, education, technology. And that's a common problem with divided societies. A reason can be clear to understand. First, those in the 1%, as we call it in the United States, those in the 1% don't need public education. They don't need public transportation. They don't need public parks. They don't need all the things that make all these public investments that are so important to making our society function. Moreover, they worry that a strong government might use some of its powers to make those at the top pay their fair share. You know, we recently had an election in which one of the candidates was for the president of the United States, a very wealthy man, admitted to paying only less than 15% of his income in taxes. And that was because we have a tax law that taxes speculators at a lower rate than it taxes those who work for a living. That kind of tax structure distorts our economy, leads to more speculation and more instability. But another aspect of what was going on was that he was keeping his money in the Cayman Islands. Now, people don't keep, I have a great deal of appreciation, I'm sure you do, for warm tropical climates. But it's perfectly clear that he wasn't keeping his money in the Cayman Islands because money grows faster in the sunshine. Quite the contrary, it was because of the lack of transparency, the lack of sunshine in the Cayman Islands, that money may grow faster. So the point is that if you made these individuals pay their fair share, we're not talking about redistribution even, we're just saying pay your fair share, their income might go, after taxes, might go down. So these individuals want a weak public sector, but the consequence is that we all pay, and even the 1% pays a high price because of the lack of investment in infrastructure, technology, and education. And finally, inequality weakens aggregate demand. Those at the top save a significant fraction of their income, or to put it another way, I mentioned before that those at the bottom, before the crisis, were spending 110% of their income. Well, even when we have a financial system that's working, they'll only be spending roughly 100% of their income. But spending 100% of their income is still more than those who spend much less than 100% of their income. And so when you move money from the bottom of the pyramid to the top, total demand goes down, unless you do something to offset that. And what we did to offset that before 2008 was to create a bubble. That was not a long-term solution. The long-term solution is to deal with the problem, the underlying problem of inequality. So the overall point I want to emphasize is that we are paying a large economic price. I said that there is not only an economic price, but also a political price, that it does undermine our democracy. And that's becoming even worse in recent years. If we look at how our economy works, it's very sensitive to the rules of the game. Every law, regulation affects both the efficiency of the economy, but also inequality. For instance, we have a bankruptcy law in the United States that helps distort our economy. Bankruptcy law seems like arcane, but bankruptcy law says if a borrower can't pay what is owed, who gets first claim? And those rules of the game have a big effect on the structure of the government. Now, in most humane societies, there's a clear rule who gets first claim. Those who've worked get paid first. After all, they're dependent on their wages. They've given their labor. It can't be taken back. So they're given first claim, and then other claimants come after that. The United States is an exception. Who did we give first claimant? Without anybody having a good public debate about this. It was the banks and their derivatives. Those risky products, remember the CDSs that were the basis of the collapse of AIG that required a $180 billion bailout from the federal government? Well, the reason we had so many derivatives is that we had a bankruptcy law that said they were the first claimants. We encouraged them. That was part of America's industrial policy to create an overbloated financial sector. Well, the reason I'm emphasizing that is that these rules of the game come out of the political process. The rules of the game in themselves in politics are part of the political process. So we have a Supreme Court that said corporations are people. It's a novel idea. But having said that corporations are people, they then said they have the right to spend unlimited amounts of money to basically distort our political process. So the result of that is that we have a system where high economic inequality translates into high political inequality, and high political inequality translates into even higher economic inequality. We are in the midst of a vicious political circle, undermining our democracy, dividing our society, moving us closer and closer to a regime that is not described well by one person, one vote, but more by $1, one vote. I now want to come to the critical issue of what are the policies that can deal with these problems? What can we do? There's no silver bullet. A problem that has been long festering for more than 3 decades won't be dealt with quickly. I can encourage all of you to buy my book and read. In the last chapter, I set out a comprehensive agenda, 21 different ideas that would make, I think, a significant dent in the degree of inequality. Here I want to focus on 3 sets of policies, policies that I think are of particularly relevance to Puerto Rico. The first is full employment. It's the most important policy. And the good news is that at last we have a Fed headed by a former student of mine that is beginning to understand the importance of full employment and moving from inflation targeting to employment targeting. But unfortunately, not everyone in Congress, and certainly none of the people in the rating agencies, understand this. I'm not sure that they really care. There's been a lot of talk about austerity in Europe and the adverse effect of austerity, how it's a vicious cycle, making the economy weaker, leading to lower tax revenues, not even succeeding in improving the fiscal position of the countries, at least as much as they had hoped. But unbeknownst, the U.S. has been experiencing a mild version of this austerity. Today we have in the United States about 500,000 fewer public sector employees than we had before the crisis. Well, if we had a normal expansion of our public sector employees, we would have something like 2 million more public sector employees. There's a shortfall, in other words, of about 2.5 million. And this, of course, is lowering demand, increasing unemployment. And all of this hurts those at the bottom and in the middle thrice over. They're hurt directly by the unemployment, but they're also hurt indirectly by the downward pressure on wages. And finally, they're hurt by the cutbacks in public service. The adverse effects of this kind of austerity can again be seen by the statistics. I mentioned how bad inequality is in the United States. That was true before the crisis, but since the crisis, things have by and large gotten much worse. And there's one statistic that epitomizes how bad things have gotten. Since 2009, period 2009 to 2012, the most recent year we have the data, 95% of the gains that have occurred in the United States in our so-called recovery have gone to the upper 1%. And that means the 99% don't know about a so-called recovery. When you talk about recovery, they laugh. They believe the government is manipulating data. It's not. It's just that there's no recovery for most Americans. So to me, the most important policy for dealing with the problem of inequality is making sure that we have a job for everyone who wants. We are nowhere near that today. the unemployment statistics in the United States distorts the magnitude of the problems that the country faces. The second issue has to do with education. I talked again before about the lack of opportunity in the United States, and the main reason for this is a reduction in educational opportunity. Tuition, things have gotten, again, much worse since the crisis. Tuition has been soaring partly as a result of cutbacks in state aid to state universities. Meanwhile, as I described before, wages of the typical family are going down. So costs are going up, wages are going down, making education less and less affordable. The only way that most people can afford the college education that they recognize they need is by borrowing. And today, student debt in the United States exceeds credit card debt. Student debt in the United States is over $1 trillion and is beginning to have a macroeconomic effect on the United States. It's a key failure. We aren't doing anything to ensure educational opportunity. Other countries have figured out how to deal with the problem. Australia, for instance, has an expansive program called income contingent loans to make sure that educational opportunity is available for every citizen in their country, regardless of the income of their parents, and without saddling young people with a burden that is beyond their ability. What they pay back is related to their future income. In the United States, on the other hand, we've gone exactly the other way. I mentioned before our bankruptcy law. One of the most invidious aspects of the bankruptcy law passed under President Bush was to say that student debt could not be discharged even in bankruptcy. So you could get a fresh start if you borrow money to buy a yacht and you can't afford it. You can get a fresh start if you borrow money to buy anything else, but not education. A deliberate policy to make it more difficult for students to get access to education. The third key policy that I want to emphasize is industrial policies. Policies that explicitly promote economic growth. In fact, the most important successes in the United States, such as Silicon Valley, are related to government investments, including government investments in education. It's not an accident that Silicon Valley is located where it is. It's located next to Stanford University. And it was the university that promoted these innovations, which have been one of the main sources of growth for the country as a whole. And historically, government investments in technology have been the basis of our economic growth. If you look back, I talked earlier about our investments in agriculture and technology, beginning with the Morrill Act of 1863. Telecom, the internet, was a result of government investments. But going back more than a century, the first telegraph line was financed by the U.S. government. But instead of these kinds of government investments, we have policies that actually inhibit growth, particularly inhibit growth in Puerto Rico. Policies like the Jones Act that make transportation more expensive. There was a policy here in Puerto Rico, but it was not well designed for the future. It encouraged pharmaceutical industry to come here, but didn't lead to the creation of a dynamic learning society that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. The U.S. did have an industrial policy, as I mentioned before. It was an industrial policy to encourage the financial sector, and it worked. It created an overbloated financial sector. There was special tax provision, special treatment under bankruptcy law, bailouts, repeated bailouts of the banks. Even today, we allow the Let me just conclude by a few more remarks about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has been going through a difficult time. That's to put it mildly. It's partly a result of the political framework with the United States, and I alluded just now to some aspects of that. What is very clear is that there needs to be more flexibility in the design of the programs. The Jones Act is not only hurting Puerto Rico, it hurts Hawaii, it hurts many other parts. Very high cost per job created. I think that it's important for Puerto Rico to make clear demands to the United States for what is needed. And when we talk about what is needed, one needs to focus both on the demand side and on the supply side, and there's a debate about both of those factors, and I'll mention very briefly a few of those. But I think one can make not only the point that there is a moral argument for the United States to do the right thing, but there's also an argument that can be made that it's in its own economic interest. I've been engaged a lot in a set of issues that are somewhat different, but in some ways parallel, and that is those related to the EU, and a particular country within the EU that's having some difficulties as well, called Greece. Europe always makes the United States feel good because we realize that things could be worse. And maybe that experience should also make Puerto Rico feel good, because Greece's declining GDP has been about twice that of Puerto Rico's. It's down about 25% adjusted for inflation, and their unemployment rate now is twice that of Puerto Rico. It's over 25%. Youth unemployment is over 60%, and it's been that way since 2008. Greece, Spain, these countries are in depression. They're worse than the Great Depression. And it has, again, to do with some of the relationships, the rules of the game that relate each of the countries to the EU. When the crisis broke out, beginning of 2010, I remember I was in Greece and I gave a lecture in which I said I hoped that Germany and the rest of the EU would do the right thing, and that it was in the interest of Germany and the rest of Europe to do the right thing, that if they didn't do that, it would cost them a lot. And that has proven to be the case already. They still haven't done what they needed to do. They've been giving just the bare amount of assistance that they need. The country has, country, as I say, has remained in deep depression. They're celebrating the fact that the depression isn't getting deeper, but not getting deeper is not getting better. And there is no light at the end of this tunnel, no hope that they will get out of the depression, that per capita income return back to where it was anytime soon, that the unemployment rate will return to normal anytime soon. And meanwhile, all the talented young people are leaving the country with strong implications for future potential growth. Well, I think similar arguments can be made for the United States, that it would be in the United States' interest to develop a better framework. And that, for instance, on the supply side, would include a redesign of the transfer programs to provide better incentives. But there is also a need both on demand and on the supply side. While it's important for Puerto Rico to articulate what I think is a comprehensive set of demands on the United States of what kinds of changes in the economic structure would facilitate growth and the end of this kind of recession in Puerto Rico, there are policies that, even within the current framework, I think Puerto Rico could undertake. that would improve its situation. Again, what is needed is a comprehensive agenda, and I obviously in these few minutes don't have time to go through it all. But what I want to emphasize is that there are both advantages and disadvantages of each of the aspects. For instance, in the discussion with Greece, one of the real problems with Greece is the fixed exchange rate. When the euro was formulated, people said it was not an optimal currency area. Bringing countries that are markedly different together is a recipe for disaster. And it was a recipe for disaster. They had that. But on the other hand, a fixed exchange rate has some advantages in bringing greater exchange rate stability, which is important for many kinds of enterprises. But the lack of exchange rate flexibility necessitates designing policies that offset that problem. There is a necessity, for instance, to make sure that there's an adequate flow of funds to firms. I talked about the dysfunctional financial sector in the United States and how it failed to ensure that there was a flow of funds, particularly to small and medium-sized enterprises. Even today, 5 years after the crisis, the flow of funds to credit to small and medium-sized enterprises is 20% below what it was before the crisis. We haven't fixed that part of the system. The financial sector is still more interested in speculation, market manipulation, than they are in their core business of lending. Understandable, because there's more money to be made, and we have tax provisions that encourage it. Well, that brings me back to the theme I talked about of industrial policy. There needs to be active government policies to promote productivity increases. If you can't change the exchange rate, you have to work on the other side of increasing productivity. And this is where education and the link between research and enterprise formation becomes absolutely critical. I want to conclude with a remark. Rob Emanuel, who was chief of staff to President Obama, said at the beginning of the crisis, "We shouldn't let a crisis go to waste." Well, I think President Obama did let that crisis go to waste. As I described, we are not out in any sense. We have not dealt with the fundamental problems. Well, my hope is that Puerto Rico won't let the current crisis, which has been longer standing, go to waste. I hope that this crisis and the resolution of the crisis will open up a new chapter in the island's history. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. 41 years have been a lot of time, so we have many, many questions. The first one, in a TV interview, you stated that the proponents of globalization were not honest about its consequence on worker wages in developed countries. Are there other areas of dishonest discourse regarding the consequences of globalization?
Yeah, globalization has been a big benefit to some parts of the global economy, in those parts of the global economy that have managed it well, but there's a high cost, and we often don't think about the distributive consequences of various provisions. So let me just give a couple examples. First, on the success side, I don't think China nor India would have succeeded without globalization. China's been able to export enormously. India has successes in a whole variety of high-tech sectors that have been the basis of its economic growth. But both of those countries, huge countries, more than 2 billion people together, were very good in managing globalization. They didn't follow the ideology. For instance, neither of the countries opened up their markets to the unfettered flows of short-term capital, which can rush in and rush out. So they tried to regulate their economy. They never bought into the doctrine that the United States would try to sell all over the world, that financial markets should be deregulated. They understood that you needed strong regulation. Well, right now, the United States is engaged in discussions about TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and another trade agreement with the across the Atlantic. And there has not been a full and open discussion of the consequences. In a way, let me go back to one of the themes associated with Puerto Rico. One of the big issues in any regional trade agreement, and these are not global trade agreements, but they're regional trade agreements. One of the consequences, one of the issues that's always debated is, to what extent is there trade creation versus trade diversion? When you lower some barriers and you don't lower others, then trade goes through the more advantageous and is diverted from other sources. Well, that's been one of the problems that Puerto Rico has faced, is that the advantages that Puerto Rico had in having free trade with the United States have diminished with NAFTA, for instance, that we're celebrating the 20th anniversary. And some of those advantages will be diminished further with TPP and the transatlantic. And that means that one has to be more careful in the design of policies that will affect Puerto Rico, because the advantages are being offset, and then one has to think about what are the disadvantages. One of the real, and I like the question, because one of the real criticisms of these two discussions going on now on globalization, on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the transatlantic one, is that they are not open. The U.S. trade representative has been willing to share the negotiating position of the U.S. with corporations, but not with the rest of society. So we don't know fully what the U.S. is asking. But the response, both of civil society and many members of Congress, including some of the key people in some of the key committees, is we're not going to give you a blank check to pass any trade agreement if we don't know what you're asking for. So to give you just one example of what is rumored, and we have some idea, because the wonderful thing about it, our society, is that things leak. And even if the NSA doesn't get it, we'll get it through other sources. So one of the most invidious provisions is that the U.S. wants to make sure that other countries are fully open to American cigarette producers so that they can sell these products which kill. We think that any agreement, any restriction on health is a trade restriction, even if we have those restrictions to protect ourselves. And in many countries around the world, what that reminds them of is the first trade opening gesture, the first measure, you might say, in globalization, was when the European powers, supported by the United States, engaged in a war to make sure that people kept their markets open. It was called the Opium War. There was a trade imbalance because European countries wanted to buy a lot of things from China. China had a lot of things, including China, that it was selling to the West and they wanted. But the West had nothing that China wanted. And then they thought of a wonderful idea. Why don't we, as we're going to pick up the China in China, why don't we pick up some opium in Afghanistan and sell it to China? Well, China figured out this is not really a productivity increasing import. It was actually not good for their society. So China had the nerve to say, we don't want any imports of opium. And the West said, that's a trade restriction. And you're not allowed to have a trade restriction. And we actually, the European powers actually went to war and won. And that is the beginning of trade opening measures. And the United States, keeping consistent with this spirit, is now insisting that countries keep their markets open to death-causing cigarettes. I hope none of you smoke. So anyway, that's the kind of provision that is being hidden in these trade agreements. We don't know about it. We need a more transparent discussion. I think if there is a more transparent discussion, some of these provisions won't be continued in these agreements.
Thank you. What is your position on patents? Do you believe they promote inequality by monopolizing ideas, therefore limiting those who can benefit from them and promoting wealth accumulation?
I didn't quite. What?
Patents.
Oh, patents.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Patents are an important part of what I call our innovation system. In certain areas, they play an important role. In many other parts of our what I call our innovation system, patents do not play an important role. Most important ideas are not patentable. DNA was not patentable. Mathematical algorithms are not patentable. The basic mathematics behind the computer, the Turing machine, was not patentable. So basic research is not patentable, and it's a good thing it's not patentable, because if it were, it would restrict the flow of knowledge. In the United States, there's a big debate about patents because in some parts of the country, in some industries, there's developed what is called a patent thicket. Whenever anybody gets a good product, it gets sued. And there are hundreds of thousands of patents every year, and if you spent your time reading all the patents, you wouldn't have any time to do research. So people go ahead and do their research, and then somebody will sue you for a minor patent. There's a whole industry called patent trolls and patent holdups. So, for instance, I was involved a year ago in a suit where there was a small company that sued Intel for patent infringement and tried, the way Intel, it's an American company, makes the basic wafers that go into all the chips in the United States, but then ships them to Asia to be put in the chips and then brings them back in the United States. And they claimed that these imports were a violation of their intellectual property. The company was a $7 million company. Most of the money went to patent lawyers. The United States, just to put it, spends, by some estimates, spends more money on patent lawyers than on research. I know you have a good law school here, so I'm sure that's important, but I think we've gotten out of proportion when we spend more money on the lawyers than we do on research. So they try to stop, this little company, Intel has been investing $1 billion a year in research. They try to stop the importation of all the advanced chips from Intel into the United States, all the Apple computers, and about half of the HP computers that use these advanced chips into the United States. And I was asked to testify on a limited issue. I wasn't asked to involved in the patent infringement and technology issues, but on the simple question, would this be bad for the U.S. economy? Now, you don't have to be a genius to figure out this is not going to be good for the U.S. economy. And eventually, but in our legal framework, there's a special provision that if it's not if it's against the public interest, that you can override this provision, only been invoked 4 times in the last 40 years. And we got them to say, yes, this would be bad for the U.S. economy now. Well, the point I want to make is that one needs a balanced intellectual property regime. And one of the big issues around the world is access to life-saving medicines, to generic medicines. And one of the real questions, for instance, in India they faced was that one of the drug companies went through the life of the patent, usual normal life, 17, 20 years, but then wanted to engage in a process of what is called evergreening, extending the patent. And there are a whole set of ways by which you can make little perturbations that can extend the patent life for another 17, 20 years. And the Indian Supreme Court said you can't do that. And so that's an example of unbound, that I think India did the right thing. Their Supreme Court did the right thing. I think, in the balance between access to medicine and access to life-saving medicines, profits of companies, we have to have a better balance than is provided by our current intellectual property regime. And let me just say there are actually many aspects of this issue, and I obviously can't go into all of them, but let me just mention 3. In the case of medicines, a large part of the cost that's attributed to research actually has to do with testing. And a large part of the cost of testing is not testing, but marketing. The way we do the testing in the United States is very high cost, and that's because you're trying to enlist the doctors that once the drug is approved, they will prescribe it. So I've written that there is another way of organizing the testing processes that will be free from some of the conflicts of interest that have marked the American drug industry, and that would be a better way of doing it. Just 2 other examples of problems, just to illustrate the problems caused by IPR and to show you how difficult and how important it is to get the right balance. You all probably know the story of the Wright brothers having invented the airplane, or the critical aspect of the airplane. Actually, it turns out that basic innovation was discovered by a Brazilian many years before. Really interesting example of the fact that the patent office often doesn't know what is patentable, because you're not supposed to patent something that everybody knows, but not everybody knew it. The Americans didn't know about it. But whenever I talk about this to my students, we always have a Brazilian in the class, and he said, oh, the Wright brothers didn't invent it. It was done by a Brazilian. So everybody in Brazil knows this. But the point is that after the Wright brothers, the U.S. airplane industry did not develop, and that was because the patent office gave 2 different patents to 2 different people. And they created a patent thicket. Nobody wanted to innovate, because if they got the right from one person, the other person would sue. And to pay both of the guys off was prohibitively expensive. So it was not until World War I when, as I jokingly said, the imperative of being able to bomb Germany outweighed the importance of our patent laws, that what we did is we nationalized the patents. We formed a patent pool, and the U.S. government decided how much each person was going to get. But the patents were a real impediment to innovation. The second example is the automobile. A patent was given for a 4-wheel self-propelled vehicle, and the person who had it, his intent was not to develop the automobile, but to develop a cartel to make sure the price was high. Henry Ford had another idea. He wanted a low-price automobile. He sued and lost originally, but eventually prevailed. But if he had not had the persistence and the deep pockets, the development of the automobile would have been delayed by a long time. Now, from the point of view of global warming, that might have been a good thing. But from the perspective of innovation, it was clearly an impediment to innovation.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. We have many more questions, but you have a tight agenda today, so we want to thank you on behalf of the University of Puerto Rico for